PA Books is a production of PCN, a nonprofit television network. Listeners like you make our programming possible. To learn more about PCN's mission and to support PCN with a donation, visit PCNTV.com. This link and others can be found in our show notes. We appreciate your support.
Welcome to the PA Books Podcast. I'm Phil Beckman. PA Books features interviews with authors about books on Pennsylvania history, culture, and people. In this episode, we talk with Jon Nese and Jeffrey Harding about their book, The Weather Gods Cursed the Gettysburg Campaign.
This week on PA Books, Jon Nese and Jeffrey Harding, authors of The Weather Gods Cursed the Gettysburg Campaign.
Jon Nese and Jeffrey Harding are the authors of The Weather Gods Cursed the Gettysburg Campaign. Jon, how cursed was this campaign?
Well, once we dug into the 6-week period surrounding the battle, the campaign historians generally define as from June 3rd to July 14th, 1863, was filled with a horrific heat wave in June. Very humid, especially on the third day of the battle, and then flooding rains that brought the Potomac to such a level that Lee was trapped in Williamsport, Maryland for days. I would say pretty cursed.
Jeff, were the soldiers writing about the weather as they were marching in this campaign?
Yes, they sure were, Phil. Thanks for having us. They wrote copiously about it, and we were very fortunate in that regard. We have quite a few accounts that we used with our research in conjunction with what Jon was doing, examining all the data and some of the modern things we'll get into with what NOAA had to offer in terms of programming that allowed us to build some maps, sort of retrospective, if you will. And those accounts proved key, sort of our ground truth, if you will.
So as you were writing this book together, bringing both your areas of expertise together, how did you combine and interweave the meteorological findings with the soldier stories?
Well, it's an interesting process. It's funny because Jon and I have met in person twice in our lives, believe that or not, but we're separated by about 8 hours of travel. So that's made it interesting, but I think we did well to try to coordinate. We came up with a process where I would write the history. I understood aspects of the weather and would try to weave those in, but would turn to Jon then to come back with the real quantitative analysis to build upon what I had said and the information about the weather that I had woven into the narrative. And then he would go in with, you know, the sharpened pencil, if you will, and really get down to the nitty gritty on the weather facts.
Well, you know, Phil, one of the beauties, I think, of this collaboration is that Jeff brought this expertise that was largely, in terms of the weather element, qualitative. We knew what the soldiers said. You know, we knew what they observed. We knew what they saw in the sky, but we didn't really have any numbers. And so I felt like my primary role was to bring some quantitative to the qualitative that we already knew. And it turned out, I think, to be a very interesting blend.
How difficult was it to reconstruct the weather of that time period?
Well, we were fortunate, Phil, because there were some efforts underway that had actually been underway for a while, and I'm sure Jon can get into this, with an effort to stand up a nationwide, if you will, weather observation network. It started in Pennsylvania under James Espy and then went to Joseph Henry with the Smithsonian Meteorological Project. And Professor Jacobs in Gettysburg was one of the observers that was part of that project. So for years as guides, we were relying upon, actually, for the most part, a story written by his son in a Gettysburg newspaper with the accounts of his father's observations. Not many had actually gone back to the primary source documents, but we had that. We had other observations, as it turns out, from nearby observers that really opened things up for us, because some of the observers had accounts of atmospheric moisture, and Jacobs did not. And one of the things as a guide I was always after was determining how it really felt to the soldiers. We knew because of Jacobs it was 87 degrees, for instance, on the third day of the battle at 2 p.m. Well, the culminating event of the battle, as it turns out, is on the third day, but it's at about 3 to 4 o'clock, Pickett's Charge, most know it as. And I always really wanted to know, okay, usually a little warmer later in the afternoon, but how much warmer? And oh my gosh, is there a way to identify a heat index? So that began to take me down a road that ultimately would lead to Jon and our collaboration.
Jon, if we go back to the time of year that the campaign covers, from early June to early July, the summer solstice is right in the middle of that. How does how does that time period and the height of the sun, the position of the sun, impact the weather of that period?
Well, I think the fact that the solstice kind of falls right in the middle of that 6-week period is intriguing because, as many folks know, the position of the sun in the sky around the summer solstice from day to day really doesn't change all that much. I mean, the word solstice itself means sun standing still. And so what that allowed us to do was to basically say during that 6-week period, the sun was more or less taking the same path across the sky each day, which brought a sense of uniformity. And plus the campaign geographically started at about the latitude of Fredericksburg, Virginia, and got as far north as Harrisburg. And when you look at a map, that's not a very large latitudinal difference. So there was a sense of uniformity given the center on the solstice that helped. And plus, as many Pennsylvanians know, during the summer, those cold fronts that we always count on during other seasons to deliver cooler, more refreshing air don't come as often during the summer. So you didn't really have to deal with fronts being in the area. And that also allowed us to do some extrapolation that might not have been possible during other seasons.
So when you're reading the accounts from soldiers, they're talking about their personal experience of it being hot and humid. But from a numbers point of view, Jon, how do you go about measuring the humidity that they're talking about? Yeah,
so the measure that is most directly related to human comfort is a number called the dew point, which you can create a table. First of all, dew point is a temperature, so it's a number that people are familiar with. And the higher this dew point, the more moisture there is in the air, and generally speaking, the more uncomfortable people feel. And so observers at that time did not measure the dew point. They measured something called the wet bulb temperature, which, and I'll just give you the skinny on this. Imagine having two thermometers. One is a regular thermometer, and the other is a regular thermometer with a cloth sock on the bulb. And if you wet the cloth sock, the temperature on that thermometer will read lower than the temperature on the regular thermometer because of evaporation. Some of the water on that sock will evaporate, and so the thermometer with the sock on it is called the wet bulb thermometer. And if you know the difference between the values on those two thermometers, you can compute the dew point. And we were so fortunate that a number of the observers at that time, including right up the road from Gettysburg in Harrisburg, measured the wet bulb temperature. And so it was a gold mine that we unlocked. And that really helped us with Gettysburg. Now, as far as the entire campaign goes, as those soldiers were coming north through Virginia, guess what? They weren't very far from Washington, D.C. And guess what? There was a really good observer in Washington, D.C. at the Naval Observatory. And we mined that data for everything it was worth.
How does the amount of water vapor in the atmosphere affect the ability of the human body to cool itself through evaporation?
Yeah, well, certainly the most important cooling mechanism for the human body is the evaporation of sweat. So the more water vapor that's already in the air surrounding our bodies, the less efficiently that sweat will evaporate. Therefore, the more water vapor in the air, the less sweat evaporates and the muggier you feel.
Jeff, take us back to early June. Where are the Army of the Potomac and the Army of Northern Virginia situated?
Well, they're just outside of Fredericksburg, Phil. They're coming off the heels of the Battle of Chancellorsville, which had been in early May of 1863. This is perhaps Lee's greatest victory. Lee's on a roll. And this is something that's going to be his springboard to decide to basically present a plan to the Confederate authorities, Jefferson Davis, his cabinet, that perhaps this is the time to move the Army north. Once again, remember they had done this in September of 1862 to some degree. They're called at Antietam. You have that battle. But Lee's going to go in earnest this time, going to head north, and wants to accomplish several things. First of all, he wants to give relief to Virginia. They've been fighting down there for 2 years. Let's get the theater of action somewhere else. Let's threaten perhaps a major northern city like Harrisburg, or a city like Baltimore, or even the nation's capital. We're going to perhaps maneuver the Union Army in the ground of our choosing once and for all and put an end to the war. At a minimum, by moving the theater of action north, we might change the mindset of some of the Northerners who think this war is not such a big deal. Well, all of a sudden it's in your backyard. Maybe it is. And so those are some of the primary drivers that convinces Lee, and he's able to convince the Confederate cabinet and Jefferson Davis specifically that this is a good plan. So on June 3rd, they're going to begin to leave the vicinity of Fredericksburg on the sly, if you will. They're going to kind of sneak away and make it look like they're not going anywhere by holding some troops fast to the river there, and begin to move west and out towards the Shenandoah Valley. And that's going to be key, Phil, because that's a perfect avenue of approach. You've got mountains on both sides, and you can guard the mountain passes with your cavalry and keep the enemy from determining what you're up to if you're doing a good job of it. And they do for quite a while, and they steal a march on the Union Army. So gradually the Union Army will begin to realize that Lee has made a movement, and by the time they're certain of it, they've got to move with alacrity. And that's what spells trouble for them when they run into this heat wave that John mentioned earlier.
John, this first period, the initial period where the Confederate troops start moving out, you cover in your book June 3rd to the 9th. What was unique about that period weather-wise?
It was probably the most benign week or so of the campaign. There were some citizen observers in Fredericksburg that we quote in the book who talked about how delightful the weather was. So it was neither hot nor all that humid. It was just one of those stretches in June where I think people would say, this isn't too bad, but we know what's coming.
And what's coming is a period that you say in the book, you say in terms of sheer misery brought upon both armies by the weather period from June 10 to 18, stands above all others during the Gettysburg Campaign for the combination of heat and humidity. What was going on?
Well, it's just one of those periods, Phil, that we're familiar with here in Pennsylvania, but which is even more common in Virginia in June. It was a serious heat wave. I mean, the soldiers complained. I mean, I got to give Jeff props here. He compiled a huge Word document of quotes from soldiers, diaries, letters that absolutely convinced not only us, but historians who have studied this before, that the period from the 15th to the 18th of June 1863 was absolutely brutal on the troops. But what we were able to do, given that many of the troops were only a stone's throw from Washington, D.C. at the time, extrapolating the Washington, D.C. data to the location of most of the troops, very reasonable. And Washington, D.C. had a 4-day period from the 15th to the 18th of June, 1863, where the high temperature was at least 93 degrees. And we were able to determine using some comparisons with other Washington, D.C. data that at that time, such a stretch was very unusual. Then you throw in the humidity. Fortunately, the observer at the Naval Observatory in Washington, D.C. measured that thing we called wet bulb temperature, which means we knew the dew point, which means we were able to compute the heat index, or at least estimate the heat index. And we estimated at the peak of the heat wave, which would have been June 17th, the heat index may very well have been in the upper 100 teens. We estimated it at 117 to 118, plus a couple degrees. And when you look at even modern day records from the airports in the vicinity of Washington, D.C., National Airport, Dulles, you can't find a 117 degree heat index, even in the modern day records in June. It's very unusual. And so just a horrific heat wave. And it got me thinking what these generals wouldn't have paid for an accurate 3-day forecast, how it would have changed the way they planned. And as I'm sure Jeff can tell you, during that heat wave, the armies were not necessarily marching the same amount.
Yeah, that's exactly right, John. And unfortunately for most of the Union Army, each corps is marching 20 or 30 miles a day at that time. And so this weather's taken an extreme toll on the troops in terms of what they're having to deal with. Remember, they're carrying 40 pounds of equipment on average, a 12-pound rifle. The uniforms they're wearing aren't necessarily conducive to comfort. Many of them barefooted, and guys suffering tremendously with different ailments. And now they're having to march in that kind of heat, that kind of distance. And it just takes its toll on many, many men falling out. I'm talking about in the hundreds and upwards of thousands. We have quotes. And of course, a significant amount of those would die of heat stroke. And one thing we tried to do was include in the book, we've got a lot of facts, first day-to-day accounting of the weather during the campaign, each of the chapters, but we also include stories to try to bring that meaning a little deeper for everyone, give them something to remember by, because the numbers will overwhelm you ultimately, but you're not going to remember everything, but you might remember a story that helps resonate. So we include these in the battle as well. In this book, excuse me.
And one of the stories you tell is that of Nathan Halleck, who earned a Medal of Honor for rescuing a sunstroke victim. What was his story?
Absolutely. Yeah, it's one of the great stories that we came upon. And its story had been published before, but we were able to dig into a little more and actually feature some images of these guys, which we had not seen anywhere in any other publications. But we wanted to share the story because it dovetailed with what they're going through with the heat. And Nathan Mullick Halleck, this is guys from upstate New York, the Orange County regiment known as the Orange Blossoms, 124th New York Infantry. They're marching hard, and Lieutenant Louis Wisner falls out with heat stroke, and commanding officer assigns Halleck, a private, to stand by this guy, take care of him. We got to move on. And there's some other troops around to sort of look out for any enemy that might be approaching, but ultimately they're ordered away, and these two are left on their own. Well, about that time, the enemy in some force shows up and starts to try to get to these guys. And Halleck picks this guy up, moves him, and it's not just once, but a couple times. And ultimately, they're going to be rescued, but it's some time after that. And even when the ambulance shows up to rescue these guys, the driver won't get close enough. So once again, Halleck has got to, grab this guy and lift him however he can, half drag, half lift, and get him to the comfort of the ambulance and eventually out of there. And sure enough, Wisner thought so much of it that he would put a note in to basically nominate Halleck for the Medal of Honor. And the irony is that Wisner will earn a Medal of Honor himself later in the war at the Battle of Spotsylvania. So both of them very proud, I'm sure, the folks from, I believe it's Middletown, New York, where the Orange Blossom guys were from.
John, you mentioned the importance of the Naval Observatory in Washington, D.C., and one of the key figures there was Jon Eastman. Who was he?
Well, Jon Eastman was not a meteorologist per se. He was an astronomer. And he happened to, many years experience at the Naval Observatory, very dependable, excellent academic background. And during the Gettysburg Campaign, he was the primary observer at the Naval Observatory. They took observations every 3 hours, 8 observations a day, all the key weather variables, very high resolution data. They measured temperature to the nearest 1/10 of a degree, pressure, wet bulb temperature, wind, cloud cover. John Roby Eastman, Jeff knows a lot more about him than I do, but I felt very fortunate as a meteorologist to be able to look at data that came largely from a gentleman of his stature.
Yeah, we were just, as John and I collaborated online and with many, countless, right, John? Countless phone calls, I'm sure, late nights, just looking at that Naval Observatory data and the fact that Eastman was the observer. Every time we'd see something like this, and oh my gosh, they got the self-registering. They're observing every 3 hours, not every 8 hours, like the Smithsonian guys. It's just such a gold mine, and we get excited about this. And you got a couple guys in there just like hair on fire with all this information. What are we going to do with this? And I'm from a historical perspective. I got to share this with my colleagues and guides or eat this up, and all the folks in the history realm. And Jon is coming upon information that he knows in his discipline that this is truly meaningful, what we've been able to unsurface with all of this. So it's been a great ride for both of us, exciting, and we're still about that business, believe it or not. We both claimed we were going to take quite a break, but behind the scenes, we're still working on a few things.
And let me add something to that, Phil. Jeff mentioned self-registering thermometers. Folks might not know what that is. At the Naval Observatory, they actually measured the high and the low temperature every day. These special thermometers allow you to do that. And at that time, that was not common. The weather observer in Gettysburg, he had a thermometer, Professor Jacobs, but he only measured the temperature 3 times a day, 7 a.m., 2 p.m., and 9 p.m. So we don't actually know what the high temperature and the low temperature were in Gettysburg. But the Naval Observatory did that. And that in itself, I mean, you know how important it is for people to know what was the highest temperature of the day, what was the lowest temperature of the day. These are statistics that we, even in modern day, routinely keep. And we have that from the Naval Observatory. And let me tell you one other special thing they did at the Naval Observatory. They put a thermometer outside in the sun, so not in the shade. I think most folks probably know that official temperature measurements that we report on television are taken in the shade. Well, at the Naval Observatory, they put a thermometer outside in the sun a couple inches above the ground. So you could get a feel for what it felt like down near the ground, even if the sun is out. And so Jeff unearthed, and I mean, historians have known for a while, for example, on the 3rd day of the Battle of Gettysburg, lots of soldiers were laying in the sun, just waiting for hours. And so you had a number at the Naval Observatory that could give us some sense of what it might have felt like if you're laying in the sun a couple inches above the ground. And I thought that was just fascinating from a meteorological standpoint.
Now, Jon, one of the things that you mentioned in the book is the Bermuda High. What is that, and what impact did that have on this campaign?
Right. So the Bermuda High is a name that we meteorologists give to an area of higher pressure. And I think, folks, if you're familiar with watching the weather maps, you see the H's and the L's, high and low pressure. The Bermuda High is an area of higher pressure that typically sets up somewhere out near the island of Bermuda in the Atlantic Ocean. And the winds around areas of higher pressure blow in the northern hemisphere in a clockwise fashion. So if you imagine a big H off the east coast of the United States, that means the wind in the eastern U.S., Virginia, Maryland, Pennsylvania, is kind of coming from a southerly direction and maybe even a little bit of an easterly direction off of the ocean. And so what we were able to determine was that in the days leading up to the battle and the battle itself, Pennsylvania, the Maryland area were under the control of a Bermuda High type weather situation. And that enabled us to make some interpretations and extrapolations about the weather for the battle.
Jeff, as the two armies are approaching the Potomac River and crossing over, what routes are they taking?
What routes did you say, Phil?
Yes. What paths were they taking into Maryland?
Absolutely. So the Union Army's on the inside line, if you will, Phil. They have to, at all costs, protect Washington, D.C. So they're going to move north on the basically eastern side of the Blue Ridge as the Confederates are in the valley moving north. The thing is that I mentioned earlier that they stole a march on the Union Army. The Union Army is playing catch up. When the Union Army finally gets close, just a couple weeks before the battle begins, there's going to be a lull in their movement. At that time, the Confederates are moving out in earnest again. And now they begin to spread out across Pennsylvania. So they do move up through the valley, Phil, but they'll get into what you know as the Cumberland Valley, which is basically the Shenandoah Valley in Pennsylvania, right? In Maryland and ultimately Pennsylvania. They will move eastward. Troops will go through Gettysburg on June 26. Troops will head out towards York, Pennsylvania. Why is Lee doing this? He's spreading out basically fanning his army out, gathering supplies as much as humanly possible until he confronts the Union Army. And until so, he's demanding every town he goes to, requisitions money, food, etc., clothing, shoes, you name it. And until he's brought to battle, he's going to do that. Meanwhile, that Union Army is guarding the nation's capital gradually, even Baltimore. They're moving slowly north. They're fanning out, if you will, Phil, on about a 30-mile front. And they'll end up in the vicinity of Frederick, Maryland, out towards Manchester, which is closer to Baltimore. And as they gradually move north, the left side of that line moving north, the left flank, if you will begin to get closer and closer to elements of Lee's army. Now, Lee is caught by surprise at some point. His trusted eyes and ears, if you will, his cavalry, Jeb Stuart's cavalry, his most trusted cavalry, have gone off on a ride around the Union Army, in theory to gain intel, find out what the Union Army's up to, disrupt their rear, cut off communications, etc. Well, as the Union Army finally again realizes they need to move more quickly, they move in a path where Stuart cannot get back to Lee's army. And so as Stuart cannot get back to Lee's army, Lee is left in the dark, so to speak, blindfolded, most people would say, without the information he needs on the enemy's whereabouts. This will spell trouble for Lee, but ultimately he finds out from a spy that had been hired by one of his subordinate officers, General Longstreet. This spy reports in on June 28th, the Union Army is hard on your heels, General Lee. In fact, lead elements are in Frederick, Maryland. That's just about 30 miles south of Gettysburg. Lee is about 8 miles west of Gettysburg at that time. And so Lee sends out an order, consolidate the army. He needs to bring that fist together, if you will, prepare for battle now. And as those troops begin to move back towards Lee, towards Cashtown, Pennsylvania, Chambersburg on the other side of South Mountain, then the stage is set for them to run into the Union Army as they're gradually moving north, grasping for where Lee's army is.
John, in this period during the week before the battle, Confederate troops are in Pennsylvania. What are they experiencing weather-wise?
Well, it was kind of a cloudy, rainy period. It was not all that significant in terms of weather. Actually, fairly good for marching, but getting increasingly more humid. And that really was the theme of this period leading up to the battle. Increasingly more humid with that area of high air pressure off the coast. The winds are generally southerly, southeasterly. You're pulling in Atlantic moisture. And that sort of pattern continues right into the 3 days of the battle, culminating in the most humid and the hottest day of the battle, July 3rd, 1863.
Jeff, you mentioned earlier about the uniforms that these soldiers were wearing. Can you go a little bit more into detail? What type of materials were they, and how would that have affected how they experienced the weather?
Absolutely. Well, we delved into this pretty deeply, Phil. I guess I'll say it's a misnomer of sorts. It's to a large degree true for certainly Union troops, but the conception among most is that they're all wearing wool. And indeed, the Union troops are wearing wool. But we looked into this a little more, and by 1863, most of the Confederates are wearing a material called jean cloth, which is a wool-cotton blend. So in talking with a lot of reenactors, and some of these guys, great, sharing stories about their experiences, we had reenactors that participated in recreated marches that went 20 or 30 miles over a course of days, and they give us very good accounts of wearing the different types of uniforms, because these uniforms that the reenactors obtain, if they're authentic enough, and almost all of them are, can give real truth to what they were experiencing. And the bottom line with most of these guys is that you'd rather be a Confederate, certainly during the summer, than a Union soldier, because you're wearing a jean cloth versus the pure wool, and just the opposite in the winter. But something to keep in mind is that they're all wearing what they call drawers. And these are flannel undergarments, basically. So you have that, you have the uniforms, and again, as I mentioned, the equipment they're carrying, et cetera. So it was a daunting task to be a soldier in the summer of 1863.
We'll be back in a moment with the PA Books Podcast.
Enjoying this podcast? Please support PCN with a donation at pcntv.com. This link and others can be found in our show notes. We appreciate your support.
One of the interesting things that I read in your book is plants take moisture from the soil and evaporate it into the air, increasing the dew point. I'd never thought about that before. John, talk a little bit more about that.
Sure. This goes by the name in the meteorological business of corn sweat, because corn crops tend to be the growing thing that contribute the most. But yeah, this happens routinely, particularly in the plains, when in late July, when corn, acres and acres, thousands of acres of corn, essentially the plants sweat. They transpire, they add moisture to the air. This makes more water vapor in the air, which raises that dew point. And there's no reason to think that this didn't play at least a small role as these soldiers were approaching Gettysburg, walking through fields that had been planted. Quantifying exactly how much it would have affected is hard to do, but certainly any reading of moisture in the atmosphere that occurs, say, in a city compared to a reading taken outside the city in a cornfield, you're going to have more moisture in the air in that cornfield than you will in the city on average.
Now, one of the figures. Oh, go ahead,
I'm sorry,
Jeff.
I didn't mean to cut you off. It's something that we discussed, John and I, and there's actually a map that the guides used at Gettysburg was done in 1863 after the battle, crop map. So we can look at the battlefield and know where oats were being grown, where corn was being grown, and we can factor some of these things in. And John and I did this, but it came up again recently because it's in the press so much. It's unbelievable that our book comes out this summer, whereas you have so much terrible heat this summer in the mid-Atlantic. We had the situation a few weeks ago, right before the anniversary of the battle, and then we're in the midst of it again. And I saw on 2 or 3 different websites yesterday full discussions of corn sweat, and I thought, boy, this is amazing. One was talking about how many thousands of gallons that were thrown into the air of moisture just from this corn doing what it does.
One of the other figures that you mentioned throughout the book is Michael Jacobs, a professor in Gettysburg. How significant were his weather observations?
Oh gosh, they've been the golden standard for guides, certainly at Gettysburg, and historians for years upon years. Jacobs was diligent in his work, and Phil, when I would do bus tours at Gettysburg and have a group on there, and I would always go down Middle Street to show them where Jacobs lived, and I said, think about this. I said, how many of you watch the different weather programs? Certainly the Weather Channel, when they've got the running joke that if Jim Cantori shows up in your town, get out because the storm's coming, right? And I would tell everybody we had our own version of him. We had Professor Jacobs. And they, what do you mean? I said, well, we've got the largest battle to ever take place on the North American continent. Troops were literally from the evening of the first day of the battle, and it's a 3-day battle, through the remainder of the battle, be on Middle Street, right on Jacobs' doorstep. But it doesn't deter him. He takes measurements 3 times a day religiously. And because of that, we knew what the temperatures were during the battle. And historians have, like I said, relied upon it for years. And unfortunately, he did not observe wet bulb. I don't know if anyone was ever curious enough to delve into it, but I sure was. Had a number of reasons to want to know. My lovely bride was always asking. She's a fan of the Weather Channel. She said, what about the heat index up there? And of course, tourists were always asking me, what did it really feel like? And I said, we got the 87. That was a high temp. But so I had a chance. This goes back to 2017 when I started digging in. I wanted to see the primary source document. I mentioned his son wrote an article based upon Jacobs' work, but only a few people, a weather historian named David Ludlam, had looked into this back in the early 1960s, seen Jacobs' originals. There was a book, Civil War Weather in Virginia, wonderful book, and the author had looked into the original records. But by and large, not many people had ever seen them. And boy, when I saw them, I was so excited. I mean, as a historian, you live for those things. But as I began to look at the data, I realized I'm a historian. I got to get to a guy that understands weather. And fortunately, John had a wonderful book, Pennsylvania Weather, and I had read it and used some of the information as source material and said, I got to reach out to Jon Nese. And I did. I made an appeal to him, first of thanking him for his work, and then said, would you take a look at this stuff? And I was so thankful that John, A, answered the phone, and B, was willing to come in on it. And that led to an article about the weather during Pickett's charge and the battle. And we made a presentation, or provided a presentation, at Gettysburg College's Civil War Institute a few years ago. And it was about the weather during the battle. It was so well received that was really the springboard for us to now look at doing something on the entire campaign. And once again, and I won't say he came screaming and hollering, but he came along. John's a busy man. He's teaching school still. I'm retired. I got all kind of time to dig into these things. And so 2018, we started talking, became 20, 23, 24, and finally the book, 25. And I'm still grateful to Jon.
Let me add to that, Phil. The work I had done previously on this idea that got Jeff interested was in my Philadelphia area weather book, which I wrote with a Philadelphia television meteorologist about 20 years ago. And we had noted what had happened in Gettysburg and who was observing the weather there, because the network of weather observers that existed at that time in the 1840s had been set up by the Franklin Institute meteorologist, whose name was James Espy. I was working at the Franklin Institute Science Museum in Philadelphia at the time. So it was near and dear to my heart that the Franklin Institute actually had created a weather observing network. And it turned out that Professor Jacobs, there in Gettysburg, in Adams County, was the official Adams County observer on that network. So I was kind of interested in that. And one other point I'd like to add to what Jeff said, and this is important because Jacobs only observed the weather 3 times a day, as we mentioned before. So that 87 that Jeff referenced, that's the highest temperature that we know of in Gettysburg, because that's all we have. But I think most people know that on most days, most summer days, the highest temperature doesn't necessarily occur at 2 o'clock. It can occur at 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock, sometimes 5 o'clock. And so that 87 didn't really tell the whole story. And then one other piece I'd like to add here is Jeff mentioned a paper that we wrote about the weather of the battle. In a nutshell, what we ended up doing was we used the moisture observations from Harrisburg, 35 miles to the northeast, and we just extrapolated them to Gettysburg, because we argued that Gettysburg and Harrisburg were sort of in the same weather pattern during those 3 days. So it's perfectly legitimate to extrapolate what the moisture or the dew point was like in Harrisburg to Gettysburg. And that's how we ultimately did it for that paper that we originally wrote.
Jeff, take us to Gettysburg on July 1st, 1863. How does the battle unfold?
Well, the battle unfolds. Interestingly enough, I mentioned earlier that Lee does not have his most trusted cavalry. He's heard from a spy on June 28th that the Union Army's hard on his heels, and so he's positioning for battle. Well, in the morning of July 1st, actually on June 30th, an element of the Confederate Army, infantry soldiers, so not cavalry, not guys that you want out there gathering information. These are your foot soldiers, but they're having to use these guys because they don't have the cavalry on hand that Lee trusts. They will approach Gettysburg, and their orders are not to bring on a battle, report what you see. Now, Gettysburg's important, Phil, and you probably know this up in Pennsylvania. It's a crossroads town. It still is. I mean, the trucks come roaring through Route 30 all the time. It's the way you get from Route 83 to over to 81. But at that time, it was a crossroads town, too. You got 10 roads coming together. It's like the hub of a wagon wheel. And those roads begin to draw the armies together there. What Lee does on the morning of June 30th, sends troops in to find out if they see any regular Union Army troops in Gettysburg. The officer in charge is fairly new to the Army at that time. He reports back that he believes he's seen some Union Army troops. Well, there's some skepticism. So the decision is made. We're going in the next day in earnest with a little more infantry. We're going to find out who's there. So as this infantry approaches Gettysburg, indeed, the Union cavalry is in Gettysburg under an officer named John Buford, and he has outposts north of town, west of town, keeping an eye out for Confederates. They've got good information. They've got great intel, and they're providing it back to General Meade, who's south of town at the time, that we believe the Confederates out here in force, and we better start moving in this direction in earnest. And so as the Confederates begin to approach Gettysburg on the morning of July 1st, the Union cavalry sees them coming just a couple miles west of town on what we know is Route 30, the Cashtown Road, and shots are fired. Now, that's Union troops firing at the Confederate cavalry fighting against the infantry. And the infantry would have a great advantage, but their orders, again, were not to bring on a general engagement, but boys will be boys, right? And these guys are foot soldiers. If you fired me, I'm fired back, and sure enough, they do. And with that, the battle is joined about 7:30 in the morning. Now, this begins to escalate gradually over the next couple hours, and ultimately, the Confederate troops realizing they've gotten a little over their head at this point, maybe we shouldn't have gotten into this battle. It wasn't quite what Lee wanted. They'll pull back. There'll be a lull in the action, Phil. But then more Confederates are approaching from the north, the northeast, and now you have them out to the west that had pulled back in the morning. With this, Lee sees an opportunity. He's going to unleash all these troops, Phil. They'll come in towards Gettysburg. There's going to be a horrific clash that afternoon. The casualty rates on the first day of Gettysburg are often overlooked. They're some of the worst in the entire battle. If you look at percentage of loss for any given regiment, basic fighting unit at Gettysburg, 9 out of 10 units that have the highest percentage loss fight on the first day at Gettysburg. 16,000 casualties in one day of fighting. Phil, that's more than we have at D-Day. That's the significance of the first day at Gettysburg in terms of numbers. Strategically, the Union is going to be forced back through town. They'll take refuge on Cemetery Hill, the linchpin of what becomes Lee's famed fishhook defensive line for the next 2 days of the battle. So tactically, they lost day one. Strategically, though, they're set up for better outcome for the next 2 days by grabbing the best ground on the battlefield. They left some troops there as they deployed that morning, knowing they may need that ground.
John, these are soldiers who spent weeks enduring heat waves and torrential rains. What are they experiencing this first day of the battle?
Yeah, the first day was the easiest to take on the body for soldiers. I mean, temperatures were not all that high, at least not by modern standards, probably got up to around 80. The dew point was in the upper 60s, likely to around 70. That's uncomfortable. But and there were some clouds on that first day of the battle. Didn't rain. In fact, it didn't rain officially on any of the days of the battle, though late in the day after the fighting had finished on the 3rd, there was some rain reported. But of the 3 days, the first was the easiest to take for the soldiers.
Now, on the second day, one of the units that would see significant action was Law's Alabama units, but they had a long march before they got to Gettysburg and got into the fight. Jeff, take us into their story. What did they experience on that day?
Absolutely, Phil. Thanks for asking about that, because I think it's crucial to some of what we were able to unsurface in the book as far as how the weather relates to that action. With the second day of the battle, Lee doesn't have all his army yet on the scene, but most of it. However, the realization sets in that they need some troops that are out towards the mountains that still have a hard march ahead of them. So orders go out about 2, 3 in the morning for Evander Law's Alabama Brigade to march to Gettysburg in earnest. So about 3, 4 o'clock in the morning, they join the march. They'll arrive in Gettysburg about noon, Phil. I mean, their tongues are hanging out literally. These guys are exhausted. It's getting increasingly warmer throughout the day. There's a serious lack of water. They're exhausted. 20-mile march, Gettysburg, noon. Take a rest, boys. Well, maybe they get 15, 20 minutes. They're ordered back into line of march. They're going to head down towards the southern part of the battlefield, an area most people that have visited the field familiar with the vicinity of the battlefield, Little Round Top, would be the left flank of the Union line. On the march, heading that direction, they go over a rise of ground where they realize they can be seen by the enemy. They're going to have to double back. We call it a counter march. By the time they're through the counter march and get in position for the attack, Phil, they've now marched about 28 miles in one day. They haven't pulled the trigger yet. But ironically, they're the tip of Lee's spear that day. The main assault that day is planned for the Union Army left flank, the Confederate right, and Law's Alabamas are going to launch the assault. And I always say, would you plan this? You would never plan for them to be the tip of the spear, knowing what they had already been through. And the worst is yet to come, Phil. They're going to have to fight against U.S. sharpshooters. They're going to have to make their way up Big Round Top, a huge hill covered in boulders the size of Volkswagen vans, if you remember what those look like. And they'll get to the top of the hill, Phil, and they're going to take a fateful break because of their exhaustion and lack of water. They're going to take about a 10-minute break there. And that 10 minutes that they take that fateful break, we believe troops are rushed in to defend a key portion of Little Round Top. So had they not had to have that break, that's a game changer. Now, where the weather comes into this, we knew it was warm. As guides, we knew Professor Jacobs measured 81 degrees at 2 p.m. on the second day of the battle. Well, 81's not that terrible, though, right? But wait a minute, what about humidity? What was the heat index? And this is where I went back to John, and we had lengthy conversations about this. We didn't want to overplay it, but we certainly wanted to reveal for folks how bad it might have felt for these troops as the day progressed, so we could better understand what these troops went through and what led to that fateful break. So I'll let John take the weather piece for you.
Well, yeah, the weather piece, I mean, when you take into account the humidity, you're probably talking about a heat index that's in the 90-degree range, which may not sound all that bad considering some of the heat indices that get thrown around during the summertime in South Central Pennsylvania. But I think a key point here is that these troops don't have enough water. They've just marched, as Jeff said, 28 miles. I mean, imagine that. You're not properly hydrated, and you just marched 28 miles. Now, the idea that the heat index is 90, now that may sound a little scarier to these troops. But I think a key point here is that we tried to quantify what these soldiers felt simply because the only data that was previously available was that 81 degrees. And as Jeff pointed out, that doesn't sound all that bad, right? Even 81 in the sun doesn't sound all that bad. So we tried to put a number on that, and that just set the stage for what was to come on the third day of the battle.
Yeah, well, the other important thing that, and I don't think we've mentioned, John, is certainly we mentioned it in the book, is that the heat index, like a regular temperature reading, is a shade measurement. So right. When you think about that 90-degree heat index, and these guys, there were some thin clouds that day. There would have been some significant sunlight coming through at certainly various points of the day. So that could change that. Feels like, according to the National Weather Service, up to what, John, 10 to 15 degrees more,
right.
maybe?
Right.
Conservatively, maybe another 10 degrees that day. So it could have felt like 100.
Well, let's talk about the third day of the battle. One of the key events of that day would be Pickett's charge. Jeff, why did Lee decide that was the action to take?
Well, it's funny. Historians are going to know this, Phil, but most folks don't. On the third day of the battle, Lee's plan, he would say himself, remains unchanged. Day two, he wants to hit both flanks. Ideally, he's going to hit that Union Army left flank, as I mentioned, with the biggest part of his assault. But he's demonstrating, if you will, looking like he's going to attack on the other flank to cause confusion within the Union Army. And then he gets an opportunity to attack the other flank when Meade begins to deploy troops from one side to another. Well, the bottom line is day two is a draw. Both flanks are threatened significantly. Lee can't quite get there. And he feels if he just pushes a little harder on both flanks, now he can get the job done. So on day three, when the sun rose, that was the plan. And they're going to use some newly arrived troops. Now, Law came in the afternoon, July 2nd. Final group that's going to arrive in force is General Pickett's division, fresh troops. And they're going to have those guys and try to use them down on the Confederate right to augment that renewal of the attack on the Union left. But there's some communications issues. Those troops aren't exactly where you would like to have them at the right time. Meanwhile, on the other flank, ironically, the Union Army will take initiative. They'll begin an assault on what's called Culp's Hill. That's the Union Army right, the Confederate left, 4 a.m. on July 3rd. They will fight for 7 hours there, Phil, on Culp's Hill. We estimate over 1 million bullets fired on the morning of July 3rd. It's the longest sustained fighting of the battle. And the only reason, for my money, that the Union Army is able to prevail over on Culp's Hill is the oldest Union commander on the field, a general named General George Sears Green, 62 years old, engineer of great renown. He's returned to the Army to help win this war, and he let his men build breastworks. They threw up piles of dirt, wood, and rock to protect them against the enemy onslaught. Well, the enemy's got, on the evening of July 2nd, about 6,000 troops, and General Green's left with about 1,500. How does 6,000 lose against 1,500? They lose that evening because Green's let them build breastworks. So the next morning, July 3rd, when the Confederates coming back in earnest, Green has now been supplemented, if you will, by more Union troops that have returned to the hill. They fight to that draw for a while, and then ultimately Green prevails. Green will prevail on Culp's Hill, and the Confederates will pull back. Now Lee has a decision. That plan to hit the flanks again isn't working out. What are we going to do? We're going to plan B, and plan B is right up the gut. If they're strong on the flanks, they've got to be weak somewhere. The weak spot, in Lee's estimation, is going to be the middle of the Union line.
And John, what are the soldiers experiencing on this day?
Yeah, this is the warmest and most humid day of the battle. So we knew that Jacobs had measured 87 degrees at 2 o'clock. And that's really all that was known. But when we incorporated the moisture content of the atmosphere, we're estimating a heat index in the upper 90s that day. Plus, there's some sunshine. Sunshine can add another 10 degrees maybe to what it feels like. We know they're laying in the sun. They told us. Plus, that idea we talked about earlier, corn sweat, the idea is that crops add moisture to the air, may have made the moisture levels on the battlefield higher than what they would have been as suggested by observations. And then one other point I'd like to add here, because it's the only time we use this in the book. The soldiers told us they're lying in the sun, many of them, for hours. So they're a couple inches off the ground. They're laying literally on the ground. Well, we have that thermometer data from Washington, D.C. And at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, right around the beginning of Pickett's charge, that thermometer sitting in the sun in Washington, D.C., a couple inches above the ground, read 137 degrees. Now, can you extrapolate that to Gettysburg? Well, turns out the temperature in Washington, D.C. at 3 o'clock that afternoon was the same, 87, as it was at 2 o'clock in the afternoon in Gettysburg. And the sun conditions, the cloud cover, was about the same. So you can get some sense of what these soldiers were feeling lying in the sun, waiting for Pickett's charge.
Now, some of the accounts that you have of the soldiers writing about that day talk about a thunderstorm coming in after Pickett's charge. Was that just an errant thunderstorm, or was it starting a front moving through?
Well, the weather maps that we've put in the book to kind of answer that question suggest that the front was not moving through. Instead, the front was still back across western Pennsylvania. But anyone who's lived through a Pennsylvania summer knows that thunderstorms can pop up ahead of a cold front coming in many miles ahead of the front. So it wasn't the front coming through because it didn't really get less humid the next day, but it was a little cooler. The rain came in, the next day was cloudy, and that takes us into the retreat. At least that period from July 4th to the 8th turned out to be very rainy.
Jeff, once the battle is over on July 4th, Lee decides to start moving back towards the south. How do they make their way to Williamsport, Maryland?
Yeah, so Phil, they're going to use two different avenues of escape, if you will. They're going to go back to Fairfield, Pennsylvania. They're going to go through Cashtown. So areas separated, mountain passes there by about 10 miles or so. And that army's just too big to use one route. They're going to have to split it up. And one route's predominantly wounded soldiers. There's a wagon train 17 miles long, full of wounded, and horrific accounts of what these guys are experiencing in these springless wagons, and the pouring down rain, going over the mountains, and such, that it's just so terrible. It's hard to believe, but that's how they're going to get there. They're going to go across the mountains and then head down the Cumberland Valley and earnestly make their way towards Williamsport with the hope that they can get across the river back to the confines of Virginia.
John, you write in the book that the weather during the retreat represents one of the most significant weather-related events of the entire campaign. Why was this so significant?
Because the amount of rain that fell caused the river, the Potomac at Williamsport, to rise to levels that were no longer fordable. And so Lee was effectively trapped in Williamsport because for several days, until really the 14th, until the river came down. We estimate, based on information that had already been available, we estimated that the river was probably 15 to 20 feet at Williamsport at its peak. And so what we did is we looked at some recent times when the Potomac at Williamsport had risen to those levels, and no one knew how much rain had fallen back in 1863 to make the river rise to those levels. So we looked at some recent proxies and simply asked, okay, we know that the river has risen to that level in the last few years a couple times. How much rain did it take for the river to rise to that level? And so we actually publish an estimate that it probably took about 3 to 4 inches of rain in the basin that drains into the Potomac, upriver of drains into the Potomac as it flowed past Williamsport. 3 to 4 inches of rain was enough to keep the river at that level. Now, the good news for Lee was that the rain pretty much cut off on the 9th. The river went down and eventually enabled them to cross the night of the 13th into the 14th.
As you were doing research on this book and writing it, was there anything that really surprised you?
I think from my perspective, it's always good to go back and look at the primary source. And when you read these accounts, you're going to learn, always learn. And I think for me was the fact that it was much worse than I had ever really understood. And then certainly what Jon mentioned with the degree of magnitude of that heat wave in mid-June. We knew what some of the temperatures had been. We had no idea that heat index approached 120 degrees while these guys were marching 30 and 40 miles. And then, of course, what we determined about the battle with the heat indices, the humidity, et cetera. And then finally, getting a feel. There's been great studies done on the retreat, much discussion of the weather. But again, what we were using up until this point was what Jacobs had said about the rain. And he's on the eastern side of the mountains. Was there a difference on the western side? Was there a difference down in Williamsport? And ironically, Phil, there had been a Smithsonian weather observer near Hagerstown, a town called Leitersburg, who was observing right up until the beginning of the war. We have evidence indicating he actually maintained observations during the war, but there were no reports to the Smithsonian, certainly around the time frame of the battle. He would have given us that key data we really would have loved to have had. But thank goodness, Jon and I were able to banter about this and come up with this strategy that I kept calling reverse engineering, but what Jon just talked to, looking at these proxies that gave us a feel for how much rain really caused all this. And was it a flood? You'll read certain accounts, oh, it was a flood. Well, by definition of what NOAA says a flood is at Williamsport, and they've had some terrific ones, historic ones, this didn't quite meet that standard. Was it a freshet? That's what they used to call them. Certainly, the water was high. And I think one thing that we had a little fun with is had some great historians in Williamsport, Maryland, where Lee's back's against the wall, that alerted us to the fact, April of 2024, that there was some very high water at that time. In fact, it was 15 to 20 feet. And so we were able to get some wonderful images, and then we could compare and contrast those with what it looks like when the river's at a basic normal level out there, 2 to 3 feet, and show everybody what Lee had hoped to find and what he was actually left to deal with when he got there.
Jon, we have just about a minute left. What do you want people to take away from this historical study of meteorology?
Well, I think that weather information can shed new light on historical events, particularly those that are so far back that we don't have a lot of data. And I would just like to finish with the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration has a wonderful program online where you can reconstruct weather maps going back into the 1800s. And I was actually able to use that to draw some weather maps to give me some additional insight to support what the soldiers were telling us on the ground.
Well, we've been speaking with Jon Nese and Jeffrey Harding. They are the authors of The Weather Gods Cursed the Gettysburg Campaign. Gentlemen, thank you for joining me.
Thank you, Phil.
Thank you, Phil.
Listeners like you make PCN programming possible. Full episodes of PA Books, as well as other PCN programs, are available to stream with the PCN Select app. To learn more about PCN's mission and to support PCN with a donation, visit pcntv.com. This link and others can be found in our show notes. We appreciate your support.